In 1937 to 1938, in offices far from any flight deck, the United States Navy began formulating requirements for a new carrier-based fighter that reflected not combat experience, but expectation. The next war was imagined as a struggle of distance, speed, and industrial scale, where naval aviation would have to strike far beyond the horizon, intercept fast bombers, and dominate airspace before fleets ever came into visual range. The lessons of earlier carrier aircraft, fragility, forgiving handling, ease of deck operations, were quietly pushed aside. What mattered now was measurable superiority, maximum speed, maximum climb rate, and maximum firepower. The specification issued by the Bureau of Aeronautics demanded a level flight speed exceeding 400 miles per hour, an unprecedented figure for a naval fighter, along with heavy armaments and long range. These requirements were internally consistent but strategically narrow. They assumed that landing difficulties, pilot workload, and structural complexity could be solved later through training and incremental refinement. In other words, human limits were treated as adjustable variables, performance was not. At Vought, engineers responded with a design that accepted every extreme implied by the specification. The aircraft was built around the most powerful engine available in American aviation, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower unit whose size and torque reshaped the entire airframe. To convert that power into speed, designers selected a massive propeller, which immediately created a structural problem. Long landing gear was required for clearance, but long gear was heavy and weak. The solution was the inverted gull wing, an elegant geometric compromise that shortened the landing gear while preserving aerodynamic efficiency. It worked structurally, it worked aerodynamically, it added complexity everywhere else. The cockpit was pushed rearward to balance the engine, stretching the nose and reducing forward visibility. Fuel capacity increased, armor was added. 6 50-caliber machine guns were embedded in thick wings optimized for strength, not delicacy. Each decision was rational in isolation. Together, they produced an aircraft optimized for records rather than routines, for straight-line performance rather than repetitive deck operations. When the prototype flew in May 1940, the results seemed to justify every risk. The aircraft exceeded its speed requirements. It was faster than any carrier fighter in the world. Reports celebrated it as a technological leap, and it received its designation, the F4U Corsair. Yet even in these early evaluations, test pilots noted heavy control forces, difficult approaches, and unforgiving low-speed behavior. These observations were recorded, acknowledged, and deferred. From the beginning, the Corsair was not conceived as a safe system operating in a chaotic environment. It was conceived as a machine designed to dominate by raw performance. That design philosophy, accepted under the illusion that training could absorb the consequences, ensured that when the aircraft finally met the carrier deck, it would not negotiate, it would demand payment. In the spring and summer of 1942, the United States Navy finally confronted the question it had postponed during the design phase, whether the Corsair could survive routine carrier operations. Trials aboard escort carriers such as USS Sangamon were intended to validate procedures, not fundamentals. Instead, they exposed a systemic incompatibility between the aircraft and the environment it was meant to operate in. The deck was short, moving, and unforgiving. The Corsair arrived fast, nose high, and blind. On final approach, the pilot's forward view was largely obstructed by the long engine cowling. Unlike earlier fighters, the Corsair could not be flown straight down the center line with visual reference to the deck. Pilots were forced into curved approaches, relying on peripheral vision and last-second corrections. This alone increased workload at the most critical phase of flight. But visibility was only the first layer of the problem. Touchdown revealed the deeper flaw. The landing gear, short and rigid by design necessity, had little capacity to absorb vertical energy. When the Corsair contacted the deck even slightly fast or slightly misaligned, it bounced. The bounce was not benign. It launched the aircraft back into the air with insufficient speed and unstable attitude. At that moment, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp asserted itself. Torque rolled the aircraft violently. Propeller slipstream yawed it sideways. Pilots attempted to correct, often overcorrected, and the aircraft struck the deck again out of alignment, shearing landing gear, collapsing wings, or cartwheeling into barriers and parked aircraft. Arrested landings did not reliably solve the problem. The hook frequently skipped or failed to engage during a bounce, leaving the aircraft with neither lift nor stopping distance. Bolters became crashes. Go-arounds became loss-of-control events at low altitude. Accident reports accumulated with disturbing consistency. Bent airframes, injured pilots, destroyed aircraft. Official summaries described challenging handling characteristics. Unofficially, deck crews began to dread the arrival of Corsairs overhead. The discrepancy between reports and reality widened. On paper, the aircraft was technically capable of carrier operations. In practice, its margin for error was narrower than the operational environment allowed. Experienced pilots survived by improvisation. Inexperienced pilots died by procedure. The pattern was unmistakable. The Corsair was not occasionally dangerous, it was predictably dangerous. By late 1942, the Navy reached a quiet conclusion. The aircraft was not ready for carrier service, not because it lacked performance, but because it demanded perfection from humans operating amid motion, fatigue, and weather. The solution was administrative rather than mechanical. The Corsair would be removed from deck crews and reassigned ashore. This decision solved an immediate problem, but it did not erase the underlying design reality. The Corsair had failed its first real operational test. What followed would reveal that the cost of that failure would be paid not on decks, but in training fields and combat zones, and primarily by the youngest pilots in the fleet. By late 1942 and into 1943, the consequences of the Corsair's design philosophy moved away from carrier decks and concentrated where statistics were least visible to the public but most lethal to the service: training units. At naval air stations in Florida, California, and the Carolinas, the F4U Corsair became the aircraft in which newly commissioned pilots made the transition from trainers to frontline fighters. These men were young, recently winged ensigns, selected not for exceptional experience but for availability. The war demanded numbers. The Corsair demanded mastery. The pattern of fatalities quickly became unmistakable. Experienced aviators adapted, often through unofficial techniques never written into manuals. Inexperienced pilots did not. The Corsair approached fast, stalled sharply, and punished hesitation. A slight misjudgment of sink rate, a delayed power correction, or a reflexive overreaction to torque during landing produced violent outcomes. Ground loops, wingtip strikes, nose-over accidents, and runway departures occurred with alarming regularity. The aircraft did not gradually teach. It either complied or destroyed itself and its pilot. It was during this period that the nickname Ensign Eliminator entered common use. It was not gallows humor in the usual sense. It was diagnostic language. Pilots understood that the aircraft was not selectively killing the reckless, it was disproportionately killing the least experienced. The term reflected an internal recognition that the problem was structural. Training syllabi were extended, accident investigations multiplied, yet the causes remained consistent across bases and instructors. Official accident reports continued to emphasize pilot error. The logic was bureaucratically sound. Each crash involved a mistake that could be identified in isolation. What the reports failed to capture was accumulation. The Corsair required flawless energy management, perfect alignment, and constant anticipation of torque effects at precisely the stage of flight where new pilots had the least margin. Other fighters absorbed mistakes. This one converted them into fatalities. By mid-1943, the United States Navy could no longer treat the losses as transitional growing pains. The evidence was internal and unambiguous. The aircraft was not suitable for mass introduction to inexperienced carrier pilots under wartime conditions. The fleet had already removed it from carrier decks. Training commands now reached the same conclusion by blood rather than analysis. The admission was never formalized as failure. It did not need to be. The Corsair was effectively barred from frontline Navy carrier units. Responsibility for its combat use shifted almost entirely to another organization, one operating from land, with different tolerances and different needs. That transfer would save the aircraft's future, but it would also expose a new set of weaknesses, this time not on runways or decks, but in the air against a determined enemy. The Corsair had survived its first institutional rejection. What awaited it next was reality in combat, where design flaws could no longer be hidden behind training statistics. In early 1943, the Corsair entered combat not from a carrier deck, but from coral runways carved out of contested islands in the South Pacific. Responsibility for the aircraft shifted to the United States Marine Corps, whose operational environment differed fundamentally from that of the fleet. Land bases removed the immediate danger of carrier landings, but they introduced a harsher test: sustained combat against an experienced enemy. At fields such as Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the Corsair's fate would be decided not by procedures, but by survival. The aircraft arrived with its reputation already damaged. Pilots knew it was fast and heavily armed. They also knew it was dangerous. Early missions reflected this uncertainty. Marine pilots initially attempted to fly the Corsair as a universal fighter, engaging Japanese aircraft in turning engagements where agility mattered more than power. Against the Mitsubishi A6M-0, this proved costly. The Zero was lighter, more responsive at low speed, and optimized for horizontal maneuvering. Pilots who attempted to match it turn for turn discovered that the Corsair's weight and wing loading worked against them. Losses followed. The aircraft revealed a second layer of danger. Inexperienced pilots, trained under pressure and rushed into combat, carried the habits of training fields into dogfights. Abrupt control inputs, low-speed maneuvering, and aggressive pull-ups near stall speed exposed the Corsair's unforgiving behavior. Spins, accelerated stalls, and loss of control occurred not only during landing, but in combat itself. The myth of the perfect fighter collapsed under fire. Yet the environment also revealed truths that had been invisible in training statistics. When flown fast, the Corsair was dominant. Its speed advantage allowed it to choose when to engage. Its dive was steeper and safer than that of Japanese fighters. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower that could destroy an opponent in a single firing pass. Pilots who survived long enough to observe patterns began to adjust, not because doctrine demanded it, but because survival did. Combat reports from mid-1943 show a gradual shift. Successful pilots avoided turning fights. They attacked from altitude, used speed to disengage, and re-entered on their own terms. The Corsair's flaws did not disappear, but they became manageable when pilots stopped asking the aircraft to do what it was never designed to do. The learning curve was steep, and it was paid for in losses, but the process had begun. The war stripped away illusions faster than any test program. The Corsair was neither a universal fighter nor a death trap by nature. It was a machine with a narrow envelope of effectiveness, brutally honest in enforcing its limits. Those who learned to operate within that envelope lived. Those who did not get a second lesson. By the end of 1943, something had changed. The Corsair was still dangerous, still demanding, still imperfect, but it was no longer misunderstood. The myth was gone. In its place emerged a question that would define the aircraft's future: whether humans could reshape tactics, procedures, and even the machine itself to force it into reliability. The answer would not come from design offices, but from those who refused to accept losses as inevitable. The transformation of the Corsair did not begin with a new blueprint or an official redesign order. It began quietly, at forward airstrips scattered across the Solomon Islands, where combat pilots and ground crews confronted a simple arithmetic. The aircraft either became predictable or the losses would continue. The F4U Corsair had already proven that it could fight. What it had not yet proven was that it could be trusted. Pilots were the first to abandon doctrine that treated the aircraft as interchangeable with lighter fighters. Experience taught them that the Corsair demanded speed as a constant condition, not a tactical option. Low-speed maneuvering was avoided whenever possible. Vertical tactics replaced horizontal ones. Engagements became brief, deliberate, and asymmetric. The Corsair was flown as a weapon of momentum, not finesse. These changes were not ordered. They spread informally, from debriefings, from observation, from the survival of those who adapted early. On the ground, maintenance crews addressed problems that engineering offices had deprioritized. Small but decisive modifications accumulated. The addition of a stall strip to the starboard wing improved low-speed warning and reduced sudden wing drop. Landing gear oleos were adjusted to reduce rebound. Canopies were modified to improve visibility during approach. None of these changes transformed the aircraft alone. Together, they narrowed the margin between error and catastrophe. Perhaps the most important adaptation was procedural rather than mechanical. Pilots refined a curved landing approach that kept the deck or runway in view for as long as possible, minimizing the blind period created by the long nose. Power was managed differently. Touchdowns were firmer, deliberate, designed to prevent bounce rather than cushion impact. What had once been considered improper technique became standard practice among experienced Corsair units. These adaptations did not come without cost. They were learned through accidents, damaged aircraft, and fatalities that never appeared in celebratory histories. But by late 1943, operational data reflected a shift. Accident rates declined. Combat effectiveness improved. More importantly, pilot confidence stabilized. The Corsair ceased to be an unpredictable adversary and became a demanding ally. The decisive fact was this: none of these changes originated from the original design logic. The aircraft did not become safer because it was redesigned from first principles. It became safer because people refused to accept the original assumptions. Pilots stopped forcing the aircraft to conform to doctrine. Technicians stopped waiting for factory solutions. The Corsair was reshaped in practice, not theory. This moment marked the true turning point. The aircraft was no longer fighting its operators as much as it had before. The design had not changed fundamentally, but its relationship with those who flew it had. That fragile equilibrium would soon be tested again. This time, back on the carrier decks it had once failed, under the pressure of full-scale naval war. By early 1944, the Corsair returned to the place where it had first failed, the carrier deck. This return was not symbolic and not experimental. It was operational necessity. The air war over the Pacific had expanded in scale and intensity, and the United States Navy needed every effective aircraft it could field. The difference now was not the machine itself, but the system surrounding it. Procedures had changed. Modifications had accumulated. Most importantly, the pilots arriving on deck were no longer novices encountering the Corsair for the first time. Carrier units operating from fleet carriers such as USS Essex and Bunker Hill reported a marked reduction in landing accidents. The same aircraft that had once been judged incompatible with carrier operations was now landing routinely under combat conditions. The curved approach, refined power management, and altered landing gear behavior transformed the deck from a fatal test into a demanding but survivable environment. The Corsair had not become gentle, it had become predictable. In combat, the results were measurable. By 1944-1945, the Corsair's kill-to-loss ratio improved dramatically. In Marine and Navy units alike, pilots used the aircraft exactly as experience had dictated: fast entries, vertical maneuvers, disciplined disengagements. The Corsair was no longer compared to lighter fighters. It was used against them on its own terms. Japanese aircraft, increasingly flown by less experienced pilots, could not counter its speed, dive, or firepower when the engagement was controlled. The aircraft's reputation evolved accordingly. It became known not for its dangers, but for its effectiveness and durability. Pilots returned with aircraft riddled by damage that would have destroyed lighter designs. The same structural strength that had complicated landings now preserved lives. By the end of the war, Corsair units claimed thousands of aerial victories with a loss rate that reflected not luck, but adaptation. The end of World War II did not end the Corsair's service. In Korea, beginning in 1950, the aircraft flew ground attack missions from carriers and land bases alike, operating in harsh weather and under intense fire. Jets had entered service, but the Corsair remained relevant because it was reliable, survivable, and well understood. It stayed in frontline use long after its contemporaries disappeared. The final assessment is unambiguous. The F4U Corsair did not become a legend because it was well designed from the beginning. It became a legend because its initial design flaws were confronted rather than denied. The aircraft evolved through losses, corrections, and hard-earned knowledge imposed by those who flew and maintained it. The Corsair proved that combat effectiveness is not a static property of a machine. It is the result of interaction between design, people, and reality. The aircraft survived its own mistakes because humans learned faster than the war could punish them. That, and not technical perfection, is what carried the Corsair from a deadly project to a true combat legend.